There is a word for a man who works every year of his life to take care of everyone around him, who absorbs every bill, every crisis, every phone call that starts with, "Dad, I need," who builds a wall between his family and the cold and the dark, and who arrives at 63 with his back hurting and his savings thinner than he planned, and no clear idea of when it ends or whether it is supposed to end. The word is not provider. The word is ATOLL, a ring of land with nothing at the center, something that looks solid from the outside, that breaks the waves for everyone sheltering behind it, but that is slowly being swallowed by the same water it holds back. You became the infrastructure. You became the thing everyone stands on, and nobody in your life, not your kids, not your brother-in-law who always seems to have a problem that costs money, not the bank that helped you remortgage twice. Nobody sat you down and said what that role actually costs over a lifetime. Because if they had told you the real number, you might have built something different. You might have decided, somewhere around 45, to build a wall around yourself before you build one around everybody else. Let me tell you about a man named Gerald. Gerald is 61 years old. He spent 34 years in commercial property management, which means he spent 34 years being responsible for things. Responsible for buildings. Responsible for budgets. Responsible for the people who worked under him and the clients who owned the assets above him. He was not the flashiest man in any room he was ever in, but he was the one they called when something broke, and he always had an answer. He bought his house at 41, a modest 4-bedroom in the Midlands, and he made every mortgage payment on time for 20 years without ever once needing to ask anyone for help. His pension came from a company scheme he paid into for 3 decades, and his financial advisor told him at 58 that he was in better shape than 90% of men his age. Gerald believed that. He had reasons to believe it. He had done the things a man is supposed to do. He had sacrificed the luxuries, taken the sensible car, kept the credit card balance at 0, and watched his neighbors upgrade their kitchens while he quietly added to his savings. Gerald thought the engine was running well. Then his daughter's marriage collapsed, and she moved back home with 2 young children and no income. And Gerald said, of course, because Gerald is Gerald. Then his son started a business that needed a short-term loan that turned into a longer-term arrangement. Then his wife's mother needed a level of care that the council would not fully cover. And Gerald sat down one evening last spring with a yellow legal pad and wrote out every number he could find, the pension projection, the savings balance, the informal loans he had made that had never quite come back, and he ran the math 3 times, hoping it would change. It did not change. Gerald is not a man who made bad decisions. Gerald is a man who became an ATOLL. And the part that should make you angry, the part that should make you set down whatever you are holding and just sit with it for a moment, is that Gerald did not stumble into this situation. He was guided into it. Every institution he trusted, every cultural message he received, every financial product he was sold, every family expectation he absorbed without ever examining it, all of it pointed him in the same direction, toward maximum provision, maximum obligation, maximum exposure, and away from the one thing that might have actually protected him, which was a hard, clear boundary around his own financial sovereignty before it was too late to draw one. The retirement security he built was real, but it was built without walls, and an asset without walls is not an asset. It is a target. Gerald is not unusual. Gerald is the design. The question this video is going to answer, the question you may have been circling for years without quite having the language for it, is how did this design get built? Who built it? And what does a man actually do once he sees it clearly? To understand the trap Gerald is in, you have to go back to a specific moment in a specific place, because the system that is currently extracting value from your retirement did not appear from nowhere. It was constructed, piece by piece, across several decades of the 20th century by people who understood exactly what they were building. Go back to 1946. The war is over. Millions of men are coming home. Men who had been killing and watching their friends get killed. Men who were angry and capable, and who had spent 4 years being told that sacrifice was the price of something worth having. The government had a problem. You cannot have millions of trained, disciplined, slightly traumatized men sitting around with nothing to do and no economic stake in the peacetime order. That is a political emergency. So they did something very clever. They gave every returning soldier a way to borrow himself into ownership. The GI Bill offered mortgages at low interest rates that made home ownership accessible to a whole generation of men who had never imagined owning anything. This sounds generous, and for many men it was. But what it also did, what the architects of that system understood very clearly, was transform the American male from an independent producer into a monthly payment. A man who owns his home free and clear can survive almost anything. A man with a mortgage has an obligation he cannot miss without losing everything he has. The mortgage payment became the collar. The house became the reason to stay in line, to keep the job, to absorb the pay freeze, to never quite push back hard enough to risk the income. And it was not just America. In Britain, the post-war housing programs did the same thing by different means, moving working men from rented rooms where they owed nothing and could leave on a fortnight's notice into council houses, and then eventually into mortgaged suburban properties where the monthly payment made them manageable in ways they had never been before. A man who owes nothing is mobile. A man with a mortgage, a car note, and a credit card balance is a man who goes to work on Monday morning regardless of how he feels about it. Now here is the part that most people miss when they tell this story, because most people who tell this story get caught up in the politics of it, in the left and right of it, and they miss the mechanism underneath. The mechanism is not ideology. The mechanism is leverage. Leverage is the science of making someone's future behavior predictable by giving them something today they cannot afford to lose. A mortgage is leverage. A pension tied to years of service is leverage. A credit score, which did not exist as a formal consumer product until the 1950s and was not universally adopted until the 1970s, is leverage of a different and more insidious kind. Because a credit score does not just measure what you owe, it measures your willingness to owe. It measures your participation in the debt system. And when you understand that, you understand why Gerald, a man who paid every bill on time and saved carefully and finished his mortgage before his 60th birthday, still found himself sitting at a kitchen table with numbers that did not add up. Because the system was never designed to reward men who got free of it. The system was designed to reward men who stayed in it. Every incentive pointed inward. Every reward was conditional on continued participation. The salary, the pension, the credit, the retirement package, all of it was designed to be released slowly, over time, in a way that kept you inside the machine until the machine decided you could leave. And by the time the machine let you go, by the time you got to the other side of that working life, the habits of provision, the reflexes of sacrifice, the inability to say no to the people you loved, those habits came with you. They did not stop at the factory gate. They followed you home to the kitchen table, and the phone calls, and the loans to the son, and the care costs for the mother-in-law, and every other claim on the ATOLL. The mechanism is identical today, only the names have changed. The mortgage has become a product with 100 different wrappers, equity release and remortgage and second charge and interest only, but it is still leverage. The pension is still conditional, still tied to an employer's goodwill and a fund manager's decisions, and an annuity rate that nobody in their 50s can reliably predict. And the credit score, that invented number that has no legal basis in your worth as a human being, is still the passport that lets you participate in the economy. The system did not change. It evolved. It got better at looking generous while doing the same thing it always did, which is make your future behavior predictable by giving you something today you cannot afford to lose. And if you are a man who is now past 60 or approaching 60, and you are starting to feel the weight of the obligations you have accumulated, the weight of the provision that never quite ends, the weight of being the ATOLL for everyone around you, then what you are feeling is not a personal failure. You are feeling the system working exactly as designed. Now, let me bring in another man, because Gerald's story alone might let you off the hook too easily. You might hear Gerald's story and think, well, I am not quite Gerald. My situation is different. My family is not quite so demanding. My numbers are not quite so tight. So let me introduce you to a man named Raymond. Raymond is 66. He is British. He worked for 30 years in financial services, which is an industry built entirely on the premise of helping other people manage money. Raymond was good at his job. He understood compound interest and portfolio diversification and currency risk and all the mechanisms that are supposed to protect a man's wealth over time. And he used that knowledge to build what looked, from the outside, like an excellent retirement position, a healthy defined contribution pension, a buy-to-let property that provided rental income, and a modest investment account he had been building for 15 years. Raymond was what the industry calls financially literate. Raymond was, by every conventional measure, prepared. Then the interest rate cycle turned. His buy-to-let property, which had made sense at 2% borrowing costs, became a negative cash flow proposition at 5.5%. His pension fund, heavily weighted toward bonds because his advisor told him that was appropriate for his age, lost significant value in a single calendar year. And his investment account, which he had been planning to use as a buffer, became instead the source of the monthly top-up he needed just to cover his basic fixed income shortfall. Raymond sat in front of his laptop one evening and realized that he had not so much built a retirement as he had built a complex set of interconnected obligations, each one of which was well designed, each one of which had made sense at the time it was created, and each of which now had a claim on his future that he could not simply decide not to honor. Raymond's problem was not stupidity. Raymond's problem was that he had been taught to build inside the system, to use the system's tools, to stay within the system's products, and when the system moved, everything he had built moved with it. He had achieved financial sophistication without achieving financial sovereignty. And there is a difference between those two things, so large you could lose a life in the gap. Here is the part that nobody tells you, and I want you to stay with me here, because this is where most conversations about money for men your age go quietly wrong. Every piece of financial advice you have ever received, every column, every advisor, every pension booklet, every government leaflet has been built on one silent assumption, which is that your job is to accumulate assets inside the existing system and then live off those assets in retirement. Save money, invest money, buy property, build a pension, and then, when you are old enough, convert those things into an income stream that you can live on until you die. That is the plan. That is the whole plan. And the reason nobody challenges that plan, the reason every financial professional you have ever met has offered you a version of that plan, regardless of your specific circumstances, is that the plan is enormously profitable for everyone except you. Every product inside that plan has a fee. Every transaction inside that plan has a margin. Every piece of advice guiding you toward that plan comes from someone whose income depends on you staying inside it. This is not a conspiracy. It is engineering. The financial services industry is not a group of evil men in a room plotting against you. It is a machine that was designed to extract value from the gap between what you earn and what you eventually consume, and every gear in that machine has been optimized over 70 years to make that extraction feel like service. And here is what that means for you specifically, right now, today. The reason you are still financially exposed at 63 or 66 or 68, the reason the nest egg is not quite as protected as you thought it was, the reason you are still taking phone calls that start with, "Dad, I just need," is not that you failed to save enough or invest wisely enough or plan carefully enough. It is that every system you used to save and invest and plan was simultaneously creating new obligations, new exposures, new vulnerabilities, and you were never shown the full accounting. You were shown the asset column. Nobody showed you the liability column, the one that includes your children's expectations and your siblings' crises and your own deep, genuine, decades-long conditioning to absorb other people's emergencies as though they were your own. So let us talk about what it actually looks like to stop being the atoll. And I want to be clear that this is not a how-to list, because men who have worked for 30 or 40 years do not need a list. They need a framework. They need a way of seeing that reorganizes everything they already know into something they can act from. The framework is this: there is a difference between love and infrastructure. You love your children. You love your family. That love is real, and it is yours, and nothing I am going to say is an argument against it. But infrastructure is a different thing. Infrastructure is the assumption, the unspoken expectation, the default setting in the minds of the people around you that your resources are available for their problems, that your financial stability is a buffer between them and the consequences of their choices, that the atoll will hold regardless of the tide. And the problem with infrastructure is that infrastructure does not get thanked. Infrastructure gets used. It gets relied upon. And when it eventually fails, when the atoll finally erodes under the weight of everything it has been holding back, the people who are sheltering behind it are not prepared, because they never had to be prepared. They had you. The first thing a man past 60 has to do, if he is going to stop being an atoll, is distinguish between what he chooses to give and what he has simply allowed to be taken. There is a version of provision that comes from love and decision, from a man who looks at a situation, thinks clearly, decides this is worth my resources, and gives deliberately. And there is a version that comes from habit and conditioning and the inability to say no without feeling like a different, lesser version of yourself. Most men your age are doing mostly the second one, while telling themselves it is the first. And the gap between those two things is the gap between financial sovereignty and a kitchen table at 2 in the morning with a yellow legal pad and numbers that will not come out right no matter how many times you run them. Gerald, the man I told you about at the beginning of this, sat with those numbers for 3 evenings before he called anyone. He did not call his son. He did not call his daughter. He sat alone with the shape of his situation and let himself see it clearly for the first time in years. He realized that he had been making financial decisions from a posture of emergency, always reacting, always absorbing, always making the phone call stop by solving whatever was on the other end of it, and that this posture had cost him something he could not fully calculate because he had never stopped long enough to try. He had thought of himself as a provider, a good father, a reliable man, all of which is true, all of which he should be proud of. But he had never thought of himself as someone with a fixed income limit, a hard ceiling on how much the people around him could lean before the structure cracked. He had never said out loud to the people he loved, "Here is what I have, here is what I can give, and here is the line I cannot cross without damaging the thing that makes me able to help you at all." He had never said it because it had never felt like the kind of thing a man like him said. And the system, the cultural system, the financial system, the family system, all of it had been perfectly happy for him to keep not saying it because his silence was profitable for everyone around him and very expensive for him. What Gerald understands now, what he is still in the process of building from the inside out, is that the ATOLL was never supposed to be him. The ATOLL was supposed to be his structure, his savings, his assets, his protected retirement income, the shell he built around himself so that he could give from surplus rather than give from substance. A man who gives from surplus can give forever. A man who gives from substance will eventually have nothing left to give, and when that day comes, the people who depended on him will be worse off than if he had held the line years earlier. Because they will have had no time to build their own capacity. They will have learned only to rely on the ATOLL. And the ATOLL will be gone. The mortgage is paid off, or nearly so. The salary has stopped or will stop soon. The pension starts when it starts, and you know roughly what the number is going to be, and somewhere in the back of your mind you have already done the math on whether it is enough if nothing goes wrong. It is the if nothing goes wrong part that keeps men like you awake at 3 in the morning, because something always goes wrong. That is not pessimism. That is just what a life is. A life is a series of things going wrong at intervals. And the question is not whether something will go wrong, but whether you have protected yourself well enough to survive it without losing everything you spent 4 decades building. The men who survive that question, the men who get to the other side of 65 or 70 with their dignity and their finances and their relationships intact, are not the men who had the most money or the most luck. They are the men who, at some point, made a decision about what they were for. They decided they were not infrastructure. They decided they were not a resource to be drawn upon without limit. They decided that the most responsible thing they could do for the people they loved was to make themselves financially sovereign and then give deliberately from that sovereignty, rather than allowing themselves to be consumed by obligation until there was nothing left. A man with a debt-free home and a protected retirement income and a clear limit on what he will and will not absorb is not a selfish man. He is the only man in the room who is genuinely useful, because he is the only man in the room who will still be standing when the crisis is serious and the real help is needed. The question the system never wants you to ask is simple. It is this: who does your financial exposure serve? Not your love, not your intention, your exposure. The gap between what you have and what could be claimed from you. Because that gap, that specific vulnerability in your financial architecture, whatever its shape and size and history, is not an accident. It was not created by your generosity or your bad luck or the particular difficult circumstances of your particular difficult family. It was created by decades of being guided by culture and by product design and by the expectations of the people around you toward maximum provision and minimum protection. The guidance was consistent. It was patient. And it was not designed with your retirement security in mind. Now, you are at the point in your life where the guidance stops and the consequences begin. You are at the point where the decisions you made inside a machine get cashed out, for better or worse, and where the decisions you make now will determine whether the next 20 years feel like the life you worked for, or like a continuation of the obligation you were never supposed to carry this long. Gerald is still working on his. Raymond rebuilt his strategy from the ground up at 66, made hard decisions about the property, made harder conversations with his family, drew lines he had never drawn before, and found, to his genuine surprise, that the people he loved respected him more for the limits than they ever had for the provision. Because limits are honest. Limits say, I'm a man with a real life and real constraints and real needs of my own. And a man who can say that without apology is a man who knows who he is. The system always assumed you needed it more than it needed you. That assumption is the first thing worth reconsidering. Because a man who needs nothing from the system is the only man the system cannot control.